get to have the great honor of introducing John today. So I was like, ooh, goody, what kind of stories can I tell you? Let me just talk first more about Dr. John Geldof is giving a talk today. He focuses on self-regulation across the lifespan and the relationship between intentional self-regulation and positive outcomes like positive youth development. He got his Ph.D. in Developmental and Quantitative Psychology from the University of Kansas, and then he did his postdoc with Rich Lerner at the Institute for Applied Research in Youth Development at Tufts University. And that's when I first got to know John, not even in person, but I remember Rich Lerner emailing me about a handbook, the Handbook of Child Psychology and Developmental Science, and saying, you know, I think a really good collaborator on your handbook chapter would be this guy, John Geldof. And I was like, I don't know. Seems a little sketchy at the time. It did. And I'm like, I don't know. And I remember emailing my other collaborators, like, look, we all work really well together. I don't know about this John guy. And seriously, this is like a long time ago, 10 years ago.
This is before we met. Now she knows she should be afraid.
I know. And so I remember like being kind of suspicious by this whole thing. And a handbook chapter is not for the faint of heart. I mean, that thing it's a great cure for insomnia if you need something to put you to sleep. But it was a great, amazing chapter. And I have to say that navigating that one with John, not having ever met him, but having lots and lots of conference calls, was just fantastic. And I'll never forget him and Shannon Wanless. Shannon Wanless was like talking about kids in classroom settings, and John was like way up here, and I'm like, okay, people, we need to come somehow in the middle. It was just a very fun collaboration, and it has continued. I've worked with John ever since, and he has lots of, now a really nice track record of external funds and his own projects, and also has collaborated with me on my grants. And so I'm just thrilled to listen to his talk today, which is going to focus, and he's a really amazing methodologist who saves my butt constantly on that, or just reminds me of things that I always want to forget analytically. So today he's going to talk about context matters for measurement, rethinking measures of positive youth development. So let's welcome John Geldof.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And as Megan said, I was supposed to be talking about all of this, and what I really wanted to share was preliminary findings from a study of positive youth development that we're doing in Kenya. It's super exciting. I will tell you a little bit about it later. But I have learned the hard way that things move at different speeds in different parts of the world. And so, whereas I thought I would have data to present, we still don't even have everything translated into Swahili and Ma. So we're gonna take a little bit of a different track today. And because I had to keep the title the same, because I given Marie the title, I had to figure out what else can I present that matches this title. And so that's what I did. So what I'm actually going to share is just a quick history of the positive youth development movement, a description of the 5 C's model of PYD, and then it's going to be story time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tell you a little bit about lessons that I've learned throughout my research journey while studying positive youth development. And I'll focus on measurement, but I'm going to keep it loosely defined because that lets me at least keep within the same title. So in other words, this is the talk that you were promised. This is the talk that you're going to get. But hopefully this is just as tasty. So fingers crossed. We'll find out. Because, I mean, once it's in your stomach, it all ends up the same anyway, right? Okay, so in the beginning, well, to understand what positive youth development is, what is a strengths-based perspective, I want you to jump in the Wayback Machine with me, and we're going to go back to the 80s, when hair was really bad, and youth development programs were even worse. And Week and colleagues, now Ann Week is in the field of social work, so very closely related to youth development, but as a psychologist, also kind of far removed from my own personal field. Well, she had noted in the very late 80s that prevalent notions of helping that is social work practice, really hinged on people's weaknesses. We had this deficit-oriented approach where we sought out symptoms. And then when we found the symptoms, we tried to remediate those symptoms. It's almost like you go to the doctor, you say, my knee hurts, and the doctor says, well, take some ibuprofen. Well, sure, that might make the knee stop hurting for a little bit, but it doesn't solve the underlying issue. It doesn't focus on, well, which muscle groups do you have out of balance? Maybe do you have some bone structure that needs some work, so that if you keep working out and you do some physical therapy, your hips will get better aligned, so your knee won't hurt anymore, right? Personal experience, and I think some of us have been through this, right? So anyway, what this meant was that the focus was on what people should not be doing, right? The focus was what's going wrong in people's lives. And that's kind of not a great thing to be focusing on. We really should be thinking about strengths, but this deficit-oriented perspective was deeply, deeply seated in the field of adolescent development because of this dude here. Hall was the forefather of the study of adolescence. He was the one that coined the term storm and stress. He actually was trying to be all fancy and coined it Sturm und Drang. It was this German literary movement that was supposed to be emotional and lots of ups and downs and large drama. And because of some really poorly guided understandings of evolution, he believed that the adolescent period really was a recapitulation between when we were, for lack of a better word, beasts, and we were becoming humans. And so he literally said every step of the upward way that is all the way through adolescence as a young person is becoming human, is becoming civilized, if you will. This is very, very early 20th century. It's strewn with wreckage of body, mind, and morals. There's not only arrest, but perversion at every stage, and hoodlumism, juvenile crime, and secret vice. If you have a teenager, this is what they're doing right now. Hopefully not. But that was the understanding of the day, right? Adolescence was clearly this evolutionary leaping point into civilized humanity, into becoming an adult, and therefore, in order to be civilized, you had to go through some upheaval. And this was 1904. These ideas persisted in about half a century later. This is Anna Freud, not Sigmund Freud, but Sigmund's youngest daughter. She noted that actually storm, stress, strife is good, is normative. And in fact, we all know individual children as late as 14, 15, or 16 that show no such outer evidence of unrest. They remain good children. Shock. Is this bad? They're good children? Well, clearly, it's convenient for the parents, but they're not getting arrested. They're not doing all those other horrible things that G. Stanley Hall was talking about. But clearly, it signifies a delay in normal development. As such, this is a sign to be taken seriously. If your kids are doing good things, if they're getting good grades, you need to be worried about them. If they're not doing drugs, oh my goodness. Stop, intervene, and put them on the right track. And this is where we were. And we were this way throughout the entire 20th century. And in retrospect, Rich Lerner was writing about the transition between this deficit-oriented perspective and the strengths-based perspective I'm going to tell you about. But he noted that even into the 1990s, this deficit perspective was the predominant lens, right? Even though we knew that strengths were good and that we should be promoting strengths, and we had 30 years of research to say, hey, let's start doing this, we hadn't done it yet. Instead, when you looked at youth development programs, it was like DARE. Just say no. Don't do drugs. Don't do these things. It wasn't about what you should be doing instead. So we're in the Wayback Machine. We're coming into the 1990s. We're moving out of this perspective. And again, we et al. Really kind of took these ideas, formulated it into a paper that was, I don't know, it was maybe rapturous. I wasn't doing research back then, I'm sorry. But I bet I would have read this and thought it was the most amazing thing ever. Because that's how enlightened I am, right? Anyway, They noted that problem-based assessments encourage an individualistic rather than a social environmental explanation for human problems. So let's think about that. If we're focusing on problems, what we're really saying is we're focusing on the people who have the problems. And if it's the people who have the problems, then the problems must be rooted in the people. So they went on to explain that even when conditions such as poverty, which, by the way, poverty happens to be contextual, shock, but no, even when conditions such as poverty are seen to limit severely people's ability to manage their lives, attention often is concentrated exclusively on efforts to change the behavior of those affected. Think about the most disgusting, thick application of old school Western thought. It shows up right here. You're poor? Oh, well, let's change you so you're not poor anymore. And this is not a healthy way of, and again, she was a social worker, this is not a healthy way of doing social work. Instead, they noted that all people have strengths. All individuals have talents, abilities, skills, resources, aspirations. Everyone has something they bring to the table. Furthermore, everyone has untapped reservoirs. It's not just that you have some strengths, it's that you have potential, that there is hope. And so we can actually leverage those strengths, leverage that potential, and focus on how to increase the strengths rather than simply decreasing the deficits. So the effect of a problem focus, that is, focusing only on the weaknesses, is in fact weaken people's self-confidence. It weakens their ability to develop in self-reflective ways. If we keep telling people what's wrong, they're going to perseverate on what's wrong. People have lacks is acknowledged in a strengths-oriented perspective. You can't simply say, hey, you know what, I'm going to give you all these great social skills and all of your problems are going to go away. Did you know that if I gave you social skills, anxiety would go away and drug use would go away and everything else we don't want to have happen would go away? No, that is not it. So it's not a strengths-only perspective. It's that in addition to acknowledging these lacks, the best strategy is to support further gains by consciously emphasizing gains already made. Look what strengths you already have. Go out in your context. Look at all of the resources, all of the opportunities that are there in front of you. How do we align your strengths and the strengths of the context and those opportunities in a way that makes you a better person? Simultaneously, of course, we're going to be trying to help you remediate those, drug addiction or psychological problems or whatever. We're going to still be working on those, but we're also giving you these strengths. And that is the heart and the soul of a strengths-based perspective. Good and get rid of the bad. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to practitioners in specific, and they mistake a strengths-based perspective for strengths only. And it cannot be that. Because we know, and I'm actually going to show you a few examples of this, that strengths and deficits are not opposite ends of a continuum. I had a student that I was talking about this with once, and she talked about how the valedictorian at her high school also happened to be the biggest drug pusher in the high school. Right? Lots of strengths, also lots of deficits. They're not opposite ends of a continuum. So the strengths-based perspective then kind of bled over into the youth development world, and deficit-oriented models of adolescent development started to fall away in the early to mid-1990s. In their place were strengths-oriented perspectives, and by '96, Pittman, Irby, other folks were really pushing in the applied research world phrases like, problem-free is not fully prepared. Yes, we want to make you problem-free, but just because we did that doesn't mean you're prepared to be an adult. You need some extra things. You need some skills. You need to develop. Prevention is not promotion. Now, we have heard of promotion as prevention, but I think that's kind of a reflection of the same zeitgeist. But just preventing bad things from happening doesn't necessarily mean you're going to promote the good things simultaneously. And then layered on top of this was the idea that adolescence, particularly early adolescence, is a natural laboratory. If we're wanting to understand how strengths-based perspectives can benefit people, let's look at them during a time of great high relative plasticity. Our development is plastic across the lifespan, but there are certain periods where there's greater or lesser plasticity, and those are the times to try things out, because you can see a response fairly quickly. Adolescence, early childhood, a lot of folks here study early childhood. Why is it so important to study early childhood? Kids are like little balls of clay. And if you can help shape that ball of clay as it starts to solidify, you're going to get dividends for years and years and years down the road. And, if you're watching a child develop over the course of 3 years, it's going to be a much quicker study than watching an adult develop over the course of 20 years. So pragmatically, it's just faster. It's a natural laboratory. So all this is to say that the strengths-based perspective and the positive youth development perspective kind of launched simultaneously because those worlds were so tightly linked. This image is from Google's Ngram. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's super cool. You can type in different phrases, and then it will go through all of the books that they have available. For me, I tried to go as late as I could. 2008 was the latest I could get data from. But it scours all of the books that it has access to, and then it will plot how many of those books or how many of those things actually cite this specific phrase. And so you can see here, right at 89, we have a lifting off of the strengths-based perspective, and almost simultaneously, a little bitty bump different right there, is when positive youth development really started coming into vogue. And then by 2000, they were already well on the way to being established things in the field. So this zeitgeist of strengths-based perspectives, when applied to youth development, is what we call positive youth development. Hamilton, by 1999, decided that positive youth development as a thing was too broad, and he had actually bent it into 3 different types of positive youth development. So positive youth development could be an approach to youth programming. And looking back, a lot of youth programs actually were already positive youth development programs, like 4-H or Scouting, because they were focused on building strengths and were kind of doing their own thing that made sense to them without this reference to literature saying, oh, we need to stop doing the bad stuff. Positive youth development can also be applied to individual programs. So a Ph.D. philosophy can underlie a program, but the program itself can be a mechanism, a catalyst for positive youth development. And then among researchers, we have theories of positive youth development that we're kind of using to help guide our research, to kind of frame why do some programs work, why do other ones not work. And last, I just want to point out that this picture, hi Kelly, was taken at Quantitative Home of Peace. This is a youth-serving organization in Nairobi that serves street boys as they transition from living on the streets into going to a residential home. It's a residential school, like a boarding school. But the kids are mostly orphans or had been abandoned by their parents, so it's not like they could be easily transitioned back to their homes. And this, to me, is a perfect picture of all 3 of Hamilton's types of positive youth development. Their goal is to ensure that street children are rehabilitated. Most of them, 99% of them, have drug addiction by age, whenever they're on the streets, age 9, age 10. So rehabilitated and developed to their full potential toward becoming productive members of society. So it is a youth-serving organization. It has a positive youth development approach to programming, and the research team was there. And what my hope is that we can take these research ideas, these theories of positive youth development, and allow them to kind of inform the practices at sites like this. We're working with several different sites in Nairobi and other areas in Kenya, and I really hope that the research comes back to them, that it doesn't get bottlenecked and stuck at the government or at the university level. So among the approaches to PYD, my favorite, well, as Megan said, I was a postdoc in Enriched Learners Lab, so maybe that's why I gravitate toward this one, but maybe not. I'm going to pretend that it's because I love the fact that it treats person and context as a fused system. So this is a Mobius strip. This is MC Escher who drawn this one. And a Mobius strip is just a one-sided strip of paper, if you will. If you follow the ants, they're going from the outside to the inside to the outside to the inside. It's an infinite loop. If you start moving in one direction, you'll just always move in that one direction. If you think about this and apply it to persons and contexts, you might say, well, the person's what's inside the strip and the context is what is outside the strip. And we can see that there's a distinction. Yes, this ant's outside, this ant is inside, but in reality, they're all part of a larger system. So the 5Cs perspective really treats person and context as a fused system and defines thriving as adaptive developmental regulations. And an adaptive developmental regulation is just simply the system acting in ways that benefits the person and also benefits the context. This can be opposed to parasitic developmental regulations. So we may have known some people or have seen politicians on both sides of the aisle, I'll say, being or acting in ways that are locally beneficial to themselves, but maybe harm the larger context, making decisions that hurt one industry but harm the environment, for instance. We can have martyring self-regulations where people willingly give themselves so much that it actually hurts them. We're going to revisit this idea when we talk about caring, because it is possible that you care so much about others, you care too much. Or sacrificing developmental regulations, which are when the context itself puts you in a precarious situation, potentially does harm to you, puts you up as a sacrifice for the betterment of the good. Those three things are not thriving. Even though parasitic does benefit the self, and even though martyring and sacrificing are for the better good, you're really only thriving when both person and context co-develop, co-thrive. So what are the 5Cs? Well, they are person-context co-actions. I'm going to steal, I just explicitly have to say, I have to steal this from Bill Overton, who talks about person and context or different pieces of whole, using Escher's drawing hands. We have person, we have context, and they are co-creating, co-developing. The 5Cs are co-creations of person and context. So competence is my ability or an individual's ability to competently navigate the context in which they're in. Confidence is a self-reflection of that navigation and the feeling that you can actually achieve things. Character is navigating the context in a way that is socially looked well upon, right? You've internalized social norms, you're trying to benefit the context in some way, and caring is about caring for others. It's necessarily relational. The last C, connection, is of course also relational because you can't be connected to others if there aren't others out there. You can't be connected to a context unless there's a person and a context to form that connection. So the 5Cs, competence, confidence, character, caring, connection, oftentimes are mistaken to be traits of an adolescent or traits of a young person. And you have to always think, no, these are person-context co-actions. If you want to impact these, you can work at the level of the person, you can also work at the level of the context. In fact, you should work at both levels, again, to ensure alignment. If young people have strengths, if all contexts have opportunities that are afforded to those young people, how do we make those match? Because once you make that match, the path of least resistance is likely to be thriving. So the 5Cs are, again, indicators that you are likely to be thriving. They are not the definition of thriving. Assets of the person, assets of the context come together. When you get good, strong alignment between these, then you should start showing the 5Cs. The 5Cs are just reflective indicators of a greater process that is benefiting the person and the context. And if you're showing these 5Cs, that is, if you're experiencing adaptive developmental regulations, we should see higher positive outcomes. We should see lower negative outcomes. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a -1 correlation here. It's just that thriving tends to, this is probabilistic thinking, it tends to increase what we would like to see, and it tends to decrease what we as researchers say we would not like to see. And we have to make the distinction between what these two things are. So this model has gone, I'm just going to say it's gone global. These are, even though I was noticing as I was putting my slides together, this is a very white audience. It's also a very diverse audience. We have, Jackie and Rich Lerner in the United States. Ed Bowers is one of my close collaborators. And with Ed, I think I've collaborated probably with everyone else on this slide. We have people, she's Roma, Gauda and Inga are Lithuanian, Nora is from Norway, but she's actually from Uganda, and so does a lot of work in Africa. Toril and Ingrid have both been here on this campus, actually, studying positive youth development in Norway. Daryl has been studying youth development in the Caribbean. So he's done research with me in Belize and Costa Rica. He's got his own research program in Jamaica. Kennedy has really kind of come new onto the field of positive youth development. He's in the School of Social Work at Masai Mara University in Nairobi, Kenya. And then Stainan Guestdaughter, who will be here in about 2 weeks. So if anyone wants to meet with Stainan, because she might know some of you, let me know. So she and Freya will be here. Anyway, the 5 Cs have gone global. I've worked with a lot of different teams, and rather than being able to provide you just a simple research study, what I want to instead do is talk about key lessons that I've learned working with these diverse teams in diverse contexts. The idea is these are all related to measurement of PYD, but they're probably related to measurement, period. And I don't just mean like how do you make a questionnaire, but it's things that you need to really think about when you're creating measures, when you're assessing anything. Right? Measurement is just the quantification of information. So to give away the entire story, these are the key lessons. I'm going to put these back up at the end of the talk, hopefully so that we can have a quick discussion or a Q&A session focused on all of these, but I do want to go into each one and tell little stories about what made me think that, okay, yes, we know each of these things cerebrally, but what made it really stick to me? In order to do that, I need to give you a quick grounding on how we have traditionally measured the 5 Cs of positive youth development, because this measure has gone through a lot of iterations, and a lot of those iterations are the things that actually I want to talk about as changes or lessons that I've learned. So the original measure was about 80-ish items. Imagine giving 80-item questionnaires to 13, 14-year-olds. Not exactly exciting. So I put myself on here just because I created the 34 and 17-item short and very short forms, but this is 100% Lerner's framework, and Jackie Eccles had a lot of work to do with this. But we measured competence as academic competence, doing well in school, having good social skills, having friends, and physical competence. This reflects, the multiple different intelligences literature, like Howard Gardner, where you may have one but not the other, and as long as you have something, that's okay. But the items were administered using this forced-ish choice framework, which is a bit confusing. The idea, though, Susan Harder created this in the 80s. It was a way of measuring self-perceptions among young children. If you ask a very young child to say, rate on a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, how many friends you have, a little kid's going to look at you and be like, what? It won't make sense. So instead she created this. Some kids have a lot of friends. Other kids don't have very many friends. Which one are you more like? And you select, one or the other. And there's a follow-up question. Well, is this sort of true of you or really true of you? And by taking those two questions in combination, you get a 1 to 4 Likert type response. And the idea behind this measure was, well, if this works really well for young children, we want to study youth development as early as, let's say, 8, 9, or 10 years old. Maybe we need to use a framework that was designed for children. So we have these kind of strange forced choice responses for some of the measures, but not all, definitely for competence. Confidence was measured using self-worth, positive identity, physical appearance, right? We're talking about adolescence. How you see your own physical appearance might indicate how confident you are about yourself. There's character, which was social conscience, conduct behaviors. This is like your ideas about character, your actual actions, and then we threw in values diversity. Values diversity is really about social justice and understanding the importance of diverse experiences. Caring were measures of sympathy and empathy. If you're familiar with Nancy Eisenberg's work, a lot of these items came from her. Some of them also came from the Davis IRI. And then the last one was connection to school, connection to family, connection to community, connection to friends. These were all on a 1 to 5 Likert type scale. And the assumption that we had, of course, was that there's this higher order structuring where you have all of these items, and the things that really cause responses to those items are the 5 Cs. And so we would take scale composites of all of the competence items or scale competence of all the caring items, and that would be an indicator of my caring or of my competence. And as most scales are done, when you have 5 or 6 different sub-dimensions, you can sum these things all up and get a measure of overall how well someone's thriving, overall PYD. And so this was kind of the world as it was when I entered into it and started stirring the pot a little bit. And this brings us to the first lesson learned, that is, validated measures don't always measure what you think. So the 5 C's measure that I just showed you was validated as a whole, and every item from that came from a pre-validated scale. Every subscale itself had been pre-validated. This had been validated over and over and over again, and people thought it was a great measure because of the rich depth of validity. And when I went to go create the short form, the first thing I did is I took all 80 of these items and I did an exploratory factor analysis. Which items are the best? And what I found was that all reverse-coded items loaded onto a unique reverse-coded items factor. Right? We include reverse-coded items because it's supposed to improve validity. It's supposed to make sure that you're paying attention. But instead, all of the kids were responding to something about that reverse-coded nature, something about reporting something bad about yourself. Right? Because these are all strengths. I'm a good person. I have lots of friends. But if it's like, I don't have any friends, there's some sort of reaction that causes them to systematically respond differently to this. Could just be a sample fluke. But then I replicated this issue with a completely different measure and a completely different data set in the United States. And then Stanen and I replicated the same problem with this measure here, but in Iceland. This was a real problem. And it seemed to be affecting measurement among adolescents in at least 2 different contexts, the US and Iceland. And this paper here covered grades 5 through 12, and this one covered college students. So this seemed to be a fairly pervasive issue. We ran separate analyses for each grade and got the same issue in every single grade. This was a real deal. And so when we created the short form, of course, we said, don't include reverse-coded items. And that takes us to the first take-home. Reverse-coded items may muddy validity. And I'm not actually going to go all the way where I did and say, don't include reverse-coded items. I'm actually going to tell you maybe you should. My suggestion related to this is include the reverse-coded items, but pay attention to them. If you have any reason to believe that they're reducing the validity of your scale composites, use those items for data cleaning, right? If you see someone going 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, regardless of the valence of the item, throw that person out. But once you've done that, maybe just pay attention to the positively awarded items because they may have greater validity, especially when assessing youth development among adolescents. That's where I've really seen this be a problem. In the same way, we compared that higher order model, which assumed that you have PYD, and that PYD caused the 5 Cs, and the 5 Cs caused the indicators. Right? This very strict downward causality, which is kind of ridiculous. My level of PYD makes me both a confident person and care about others and connect to my peers and connect to my city. All at once. But that's the assumption we were making by making this higher order factor. Instead, we fit a bi-factor model that said there's some variation in each item that indicates you're thriving, but there's stuff left over, and that stuff that's left over might be systematic. And we got this to fit really well, again, in all 8 waves of the study. And then we did a ton of replications. So Dvorsky et al., this was not me, replicated this with college students. Stanen and I replicated this in Iceland. Ingrid and I replicated this in Norway. Daryl and I have replicated this in both Belize and Costa Rica. I should have put Ed Bowers on here. Ed's on this one. And then some colleagues of mine in Lithuania, again, I wasn't part of this specific study, but they replicated this in Lithuania. Right, so it's not just we got it to fit once in one sample. This happened over and over and over again across adolescence. This model is qualitatively different. You have to think about it in a different way than you think about I'm just summing things up and adding them together. So take home number 1B is that composites can imply downward causality. Sometimes you don't want that. So you have to very critically think about the assumptions that you're making anytime you measure anything. And talk to people who are nowhere near being in your field about what you've done, how you've added things together, because those people are your best critics. My wife is in marketing. She can say, this is a stupid idea because it doesn't make sense to her, and I can't explain it in a way that makes sense to her. And if I can't make sense to somebody else, it might not make sense. Right? Oops. Okay. Lesson 2, scaling matters. Here's that forced choicey weird thing. Again, it was validated for young children. We thought it was going to be a great idea, but anecdotally, we had a lot of pushback. Kids would like fill out this column and then fill out this column also. People would, kids would come up and like, I have no idea how to fill this out. Of course, this is all anecdotal. The data had been collected by the time I got into it. But my buddy Daryl was collecting data in Belize, and that provided us an opportunity to actually talk to the data collectors. And sure enough, what we found was this was making kids so confused, so upset, that we subsequently decided that we shouldn't do this. Even though it was supposed to make the scaling easier for kids, it did the exact opposite. So forced choices like this, not necessarily intuitive. Instead, I would suggest that you would take items like this that are already validated. Again, the harder scales have been validated 1,000 times. Just pick an option. I would suggest the positively worded option and stick that in a Likert type scale. And in fact, I did this in a follow-up study with the Young Entrepreneur Study, and it worked great. When I started working with my Norwegian colleagues, they had already done this because some smarty, back in the mid-90s had taken the harder scales, translated them over to Norwegian, and knew at that point that this wasn't going to work. And so the Norwegian translation only included Likert type options. So that was just the options that they had. Also following from this by-factor is that more isn't always better. Okay, we found that the pattern of loadings here was somewhat surprising. We had all of these items that were supposed to indicate positive youth development, and some of the items didn't. They indicated the residuals over here, but they weren't indicating thriving. So we dug back into our questionnaire to find out, well, what is item 34? And why might it not indicate positive youth development? And the items that did not indicate thriving, but did indicate, let's say, confidence or competence were things like, I'm popular, I'm athletic, I'm good looking. Right? I can be popular, athletic, good looking, and very confident, but I don't have to be popular, athletic, and good looking to be thriving. And even though this was a completely surprising finding to us, with 2020 hindsight, it made a heck of a lot of sense. And so in subsequent studies, for instance, stuff we've done with the Norwegian samples in Belize, a paper that I did, this was a different Norwegian sample, we've actually started omitting some of those items. If you have a 34 item scale, that's still kind of big. So if you need to trim things that just don't make sense for indicating this, if this is really what you're trying to get at. Being athletic, great, but it's not thriving. Being good looking, not thriving, still okay. It still indicates confidence, but it's something different. So not all facets of a construct are equal. And this is important, I think, because when you get a questionnaire or a scale from another source for a dissertation or a research study or whatever you're doing, there are oftentimes lots and lots of scales. I had a lot of people, students and people with PhDs, come to me and say, I like these 5 items. The rest of the items don't really make a lot of sense to me, but the scale's been validated as a whole. What do I do? The answer is, well, not all facets are created equal. It's okay to use an adaptation of a measure. It's okay to pull out the items that make the most sense to you because you're going to be validating them in your own study. And the measurements or measures that you select are a direct reflection of your theory. So let theory guide your measures. Also on more is not always better, we found that PYD tended to correlate with good things or correlate positively with good things and correlate negatively with bad things, except for the caring factor. And that is this caring all the way over there, after controlling for overall thriving, the amount that someone cares, that is their excessive amount of caring, was positively correlated with depressive symptoms. Right? Surprised the heck out of me, but thinking about it, it made a lot of sense. So I kind of put a pin in that. I was like, wow, that was a cool finding. I wish I could do something with that. But I didn't because, again, it was one study, a big sample, but just one sample. until we found the same thing in Norway. And then my Lithuanian colleagues found the same thing in Lithuania. And I didn't know about this study until after I'd written the paper I'm about to describe. This was replicated in college students by an independent team, right? This caring too much, if you will, is not healthy. And so using a completely different method, I didn't use the bifactor factor analysis. Instead, I just used plain old multi-level modeling, and I selected my covariates in a way that would help me parse out the different pieces of caring. I was able to show that in this model, a different sample of Norwegians, pretty good sized sample, we found the same things. When you care more than you would be expected to, given your level of thriving, you're likely to be anxious, you're likely to show depressive symptoms. So even though caring is good, more may not be better. It depends on who you are. Whoop. I'll just put that up there. The last piece of this that is saying that more is not always better is something that one of my students, Corinne Tyler, is currently working on, and that is we have this measure of Machiavellian morality. Items like, I'm willing to be unethical if I believe it will help me succeed. This is a measure of Machiavellian character, but it probably isn't the same as doing what I believe is right, even if my friends make fun of me, is trying to measure. As we want to look to see, is it possible to have high levels of these personal values, high levels of concern for social justice, and also have high levels of Machiavellianism? The goal is to do a latent profile analysis. We haven't gotten there yet, but I did do a Loess model for three variables. The x-axis is Machiavellian morality, the y-axis is having a high personal values, and then the z-axis, which is the color, is the measure of how much you believe in committing to social justice. So blue means low social justice, and red means high social justice. And sure enough, there's a bunch of people up here who care about the world, they have high personal values. They also happen to be conniving Machiavellian individuals. But they're really high on the social justice factor. Who are those kids? Who have we elected? And how do we distinguish between these kids here and these kids here? Or do we? And that's the open question we're trying to figure out right now. But the take home across those studies is that positive and negative outcomes are not the opposite ends of a continuum. You can really care about doing what you believe is right, and you can also be willing to cheat if you think it's going to get you, the ends that you're looking for. This is just someone who believes they're doing well and that the means justify the ends. Yep, there are a lot of kids who look like that. Next is that generalizability limits specificity. We always try to generalize to a population, but Kluckhohn and Murray, when talking about personality way back in the 50s, noted that all people are like all other people. There is some generality. All people are like some other people, that is, they're groups, and all people is like no other people. Yeah. Everyone's unique. How's that sound? Molinar has kind of built on this and really focused on ergodic theorems. This is from physics where you're thinking about how do molecules in a cloud of gas behave as compared to the entire cloud itself. And the ergodic theorems basically say you have ergodicity if the behavior of the molecules and the behavior of the gas cloud are the same. When we apply this to psychology, that therefore means if we look at a broad sample, we're trying to generalize, these inter-individual differences change across the lifespan in a large sample or a cross-sectional sample, therefore also apply equally to intra-individual development. That's an ergodic assumption. And Molinar's really pushed that we probably shouldn't be assuming ergodicity. We know that all people are unique. We know that some subgroups of people are different from other subgroups of individuals. So we should, yes, be taking a top-down approach, population, and then trying to apply that. But simultaneously, we need to be thinking ground up, looking at individuals first and finding out how those individuals are similar to each other or are unique from each other. I'm going to skip the food for thought because this was just random slides that I liked, but I'm running short on time. So anyway, when we're thinking about the 5 C's, and we're thinking about this ergodic assumption, we can look at, we've measured academic competence, social competence, physical competence, these very broad things that people think are good for adolescents, but what might we be missing? For instance, Svea, hi Svea, has really pushed for language brokering, that is, the ability to navigate 2 different cultural worlds and 2 different languages in order to provide translation and interpretation for your family as competence. It's not a competence that everyone shares, but it's a competence for a group of individuals. Rachel Hirschberg and then pretty much everyone else in my lab have kind of come to this understanding that critical consciousness, the ability to reflect on structural inequalities and act against those inequalities is in fact a competence. But it's not captured by our measures because we don't typically think of this as a broad, all youth need this. But when you're looking at specific youth, marginalized youth, for instance, this is really important. And even among non-marginalized youth, this is called allyship. This is a good thing, but it's not being measured right now. So the take home here is that you should embrace group-specific strengths because going deep can be just as informative as going broad. You have to do both of those things. Sometimes, though, groups aren't enough. Sometimes you need to realize that every person is unique. And so I have 2 studies going on. The first one is focusing on individuals. These kids are at the Green Chimney School. It's in upstate New York. It's for children with multi-morbidities. Most of them have ADHD, some sort of personality disorder. They're on the autism spectrum. They have a lot of problems. And so this is, it's like the modern version of what we would have done, if we would have institutionalized children because the school system simply could not handle them. So it's a great program. It's a farm. And the kids' days are punctuated by human-animal interactions. Animal-assisted therapies, maybe it's just reading to a dog or going to go feed the chickens. But it's punctuated by these human-animal interactions that are supposed to help regulate their mood and help kind of give them a little bit of a reset. And so what we've done is we set up cameras in 2 classrooms, and we are selecting a random 5-minute segment of half hour before they go to an animal-assisted intervention, a half hour or a 5-minute segment in a half hour after they come back, and we're actually coding child by child, how are they regulating their emotions? How are they regulating their on-task behaviors? And then we're trying to dynamically model that in a way that hopefully will allow us to say, what's the relative impact of this intervention for this child? Or the relative impact of this intervention for this class of children with this set of diagnoses? All right, we're doing this 3 days a week for an entire school year. If you think about, if anyone's done like video coding, this is a ton of data. We have a postdoc whose only job is to manage data. But hopefully it allows us to get the level of a child and find out which interventions are helping them, and then we can explore why. We also have the measures and methods across the developmental continuum. This is really just a way of trying to figure out how do you measure psychological constructs in a way that's responsive to day-to-day variation. As an example of that, we looked at, this is a pre-pilot, this is even before our pilot data, 3 kids, but each kid completed somewhere between 15 and 20 observations, each one on a different day. So we have repeated measures, and what we were able to do is look at their scores on these 3 items and create person-specific reliabilities, right? The score was, the items were not reliable at all. Partially because we have tiny samples per each kid, but also because the items might mean different things. So what I want you to really pay attention to are these highlighted in yellow pieces where the reliability, if this specific item was removed, it jumps way up. So for this kid, I got along with others and I included others in my activities, those items highly correlated, but I felt lonely, which is a reverse coded item, didn't seem to go with the others. For this kid, they all seemed about the same, and then for this kid, the one item that didn't go along with the others was, I got along with others today. So we computed person-specific scale scores to get at, well, this social competence, and we looked to see how do those scale scores correlate with a single item. Today, I thought about how my actions might make other people feel. And the hypothesis, of course, was that the person-specific composites should be more strongly correlated with this other empathy indicating measure, and we were wrong. In fact, we were the exact opposite of right. We were way, way, way wrong. And it ended up that, holy moly, the item that we thought was trash because it had a low reliability correlated the most strongly with this item for this kid. Same thing for this kid, right? These are not tiny correlations. Now, it's a small sample. The standard errors are huge. I didn't even put significance values up. But this is a 5.5 and a 0.46 in the negative direction. What does that mean? Oh. If I didn't get along with someone, I thought about how my actions might have made someone feel. If I didn't get along with someone, I felt lonely. Different items have different validity or reliability for different people. So take-home 4B is, if you want to benefit the lives of individuals, study individuals. That doesn't mean stop doing population-based research, but it does mean be sure to include people and an assessment of the individuals. You know, there's a whole group of people who've been doing this for decades. They're called qualitative researchers. So maybe we have a lot to learn from those. Well, us as quantitative folks have a lot to learn about that. Lesson 5, we're almost done, I promise, is that science is both inductive and deductive. What I really want to say is, when you get in a situation where maybe applying the same theory over and over again to a new context doesn't make sense, don't be afraid to shake things up. I'm a quantitative researcher. I love the 5 C's model of PYD. I try to apply that quantitatively wherever I can. But when we started going to Kenya and we started thinking about the Kenyan context, we realized maybe we're going to include some deductive codes, but maybe not. We have an exploratory sequential design. We're going to interview the kids, interview the social workers, interview the teachers first. Then figure out, well, okay, can we map things onto the 5 C's? What else, inductively, what else are we seeing? What else exists? So this is kind of exciting to me. The take-home message is not knowing. I don't know what PYD looks like in Kenya. I don't know if it's different between street children and, you know, girls in the Maasai areas. No clue, and that's exciting. Don't be afraid to do that. That means reach out to new people to collaborate. Go to new areas. Think about things in new ways. Ask people to push your boundaries, because that's how you grow as a scientist. Last lesson is that thriving is relative, right? So we talk about thriving being mutually beneficial context or person context co-actions. You know, Brenner has talked about the bioecological system, and he uses circles to define that. I'm going to say no. This is really what the bioecological system looks like. It's a mess. I'm going to say the person is right here. And all of these colors are different parts of the context, mushed together, bleeding into each other, creating this tapestry of, well, we could say this is kind of a magenta and a red and a green and a blue, but all of the contexts are co-permeating. And the person is somewhere in there, right? But it's not, there's this neat little circle that is the person, and then the microsystems, this neat little circle, and the mesosystems, this neat little circle. It looks like this. And so if you're asking about goals, what goals are you striving for? Like, we started talking to kids in Kenya, and why are the street children doing drugs? Well, they're huffing. This kid, I mean, this is actually, I've seen several pictures of this where they will take a jar of jet fuel, sit down, put their face on it, and fall asleep to stay high. Why are they doing that? Well, it makes them not feel hungry. It makes them not feel cold. It makes them feel brave so that they can do things that they otherwise would not want to do. This is self-regulation. It's not self-regulation that's adaptive in a global sense, but it is meeting some very, very basic needs. You think about Maslow's hierarchy, that's the bottom. I'm warm, I'm not hungry, and I can go get the things that I need. So not all actions benefit all levels of the context. In fact, sometimes you have to tear down the wall. Sometimes you have to do things that are not good, not beneficial, in order to promote greater good in society. So the take home here is that goals exist in a multi-level person context system. You have to think about all levels of that system. Why is this kid doing drugs? It's not because he's poorly regulated. It's not because he's a bad kid and has low character. The context is creating a situation where that is that child's best alternative. And until you provide a different alternative, that's the path of least resistance. So it's a very, very end to everything. The last take home is, if people matter and people are part of a fused person context system, context matters. And it's not that you have to say, what do we look at in the context? It's how do we look at the person context system and how do we make that system work better? So where do we go? Context is important. We need to study internationally, but also intranationally. I hate the fact that there's so much focus in the PYD world right now on international replication when we're not looking intranationally and saying, hey, there are different cultures here in the US, so we should be looking at that. We need to take an approach that we've studied positive youth development enough. We are moving out of the laboratory of adolescence and thinking about positive human development. This is a lifespan model. It's just been applied to a specific group of young people. And then if you really want to promote thriving, you have to get complex. You have to think about nonlinearity. You have to think about including bottom-up approaches. Don't just say, I have a population and want to generalize to the population. You also have to think about the person and how whatever you're doing, whatever programs you're implementing, affect that person. So this is just recapitulating all of the take-homes. I am way over time, but hopefully we have enough time for a few questions. And thank you. Okay, by way over time, I have 1 minute left. Carolyn?
There actually is positive human development literature out there already, in the adult development and aging literature. So there's the stress-related growth literature, there's the conscious development literature, there is the wisdom literature, a lot of which touch upon.
And this, I think that's the problem, is the stuff we're doing should also be positive human development, but it's siloed in the adolescence literature. And those things are siloed in the adult development. We need cross-collaboration and cross-pollination.
I agree, and we have some measures that you might find interesting.
So I think we should talk to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And did you ever actually look for the nonlinear relationships with depression?
I did. I used a quadratic, and I wasn't able to find a quadratic. I did the low S curves, and with the low S curves, it really looked like there were certain areas, kind of like with the three variable low S that I showed, where it's like, there was just things that were popping out in ways that I wouldn't expect, and they weren't captured with a nice parametric model. But we did look at that. David?
Yeah, I can't resist one question, John. I came in a little bit late. So, I mean, by a lot of indicators, youth today in this society aren't thriving so much. There's a lot of, if you look at suicide, school shootings, and a lot of other things that are happening. And I'm just wondering, what can we take from what you've been studying for years on in this world to inform societal debates or policies that shape youth today in America?
I think that's a really great question. There's two answers I have. The first part is, I'm not sure that youth are worse off today as they have been in the past, as much as they have access to more dangerous tools. On top of that, I think that the expectations that we're layering onto young people are probably a little bit too strong, too heavy. I have a 13-year-old, and he knows that he's going to go to Stanford. And we keep telling him, that's great, you try. OSU has a good engineering program too. And part of that is because I can't afford Stanford. Part of that is, you need to have realistic expectations. And we live in a world where the media makes it so easy to set the bar way up here. When you don't reach this, it can be depressing. And so I think that a lot of this research really needs to point to what context are we in right now, and how do we do these context level interventions that can help alleviate depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. I know in Australia they've done countrywide parenting education work where they'll actually integrate parenting education into like TV shows. And it normalizes the fact that these parents go into parenting education because look, the family that I'm watching on TV is doing it, right? So I think finding creative ways to infect the context with positivity and normalizing being willing to discuss your problems, I think is a good thing. Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, given how important the context is, I want to get your thought on, is there any point to continue stressing measurement equivalence when you do international cross-cultural comparisons? Do you do those comparisons?
I do, and here's why. It's not, so measurement equivalence is really trying to show that the structure of the measure is equivalent between two different contexts, between two different groups, or I've done this longitudinally, when you're 5 years old, your aggressive behavior might look like one thing, and when you're 15, your aggression looks quite different. So you can even think about 5-year-olds and 15-year-olds being different contexts. I test measurement equivalence if I'm using the same questionnaire. And that's only if I am using the same questionnaire. I prefer to like what we're doing in Kenya, start from the ground up and not even worry about it. But if I don't find measurement equivalence, I get excited. Right? It's not that, oh crud, I failed to be able to show that I can compare these two cultures. Because really, you probably shouldn't be comparing two cultures on some quantitative measure anyway. What's cool is the way the measures are playing out. One group is considering this item to be this, interpretation, and another group has a totally different interpretation. It's not an issue of more or less. It's a matter of what's important. And if you want to take interventions, let's say from one group, one culture, and apply them in a different culture, those types of pieces of information are critical, right? If you want to promote, Alexis, we've talked about this. If you want to promote self-regulation, and you're working in a context where, the self is almost de-emphasized, maybe self-regulation isn't necessarily the best thing to promote, and you find creative other ways of promoting cognitive skills. So short answer is, yes, I always test measurement equivalence, and then when I don't find it, I get more excited than when I do.
I think we should probably end because we're a little bit over.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thank
Great.
you.